Age. Hold on one second. And as we move in this course into the 20th century, and we move into talking about the United States in the 20th century, one of the things is that this course is taught in two different parts for one major reason, is that History 11 before Reconstruction is really in many ways about an entirely different country. It's a country which is relatively isolated from the world. It's a country which is has profoundly, not different ideas of itself, but certainly has different ideas of itself in relation to its relations to the rest of the world. And one of the main things that we'll talk about is not the differences, but also when we talk about History 11, those things that carry through, those concepts of the United States that we learned in History 11, we're going to find them in History 12. We're going to find ideas like isolationism. We're going to find the ideas about race are going to continue into History 12. We're going to find ideas about concepts of what it means to be an American. We're going to find, of course, as we learned at the end of History 11, these pivotal amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. We're going to find them employed. We're going to find those amendments take root and create a country which in some ways lives up to those ideals in the Declaration of Independence and those ideals in the original Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And then we'll see in how in many ways they don't. So one of the reasons why the history survey is bounded and split like this is because you're really talking about two different countries that have a lot of continuity between each other. But you can really teach this obviously as an entirely different course because you're talking about a country which after really 1877 starts to become a global superpower. It becomes a country which is completely involved in the rest of the world as opposed to the first part. It's also a country which is much, much wealthier than it was before. It's a country with a lot more power than before. And I think every time I teach this course, how dizzying the course is, how difficult it is to really encapsulate how much happens between 1877 and 2020. As we can all, I think our heads are spinning from this year and the pandemic. Well, imagine what it must have been like in 1945 for somebody that was 70 years old and was born in 1875, or somebody who was 90 years old and born in 1855. 1945, the first atomic bomb is detonated. And suddenly, everybody on Earth, including everybody in the United States, lives in a world in which the possibility of nuclear annihilation is possible. It totally changes the world. And to try to construct that narrative and to think about the United States in 1877 and talk about that United States going forward to 2020 and passing through all of these events is sometimes a really dizzying thing to do. So this is, remember we talked about in the last course from basically say 1500 or say 20,000 BC or whatever you wanted to take as your first date all the way through to 1877. That's a lot of time. But sometimes it seems like more things occurred or there's more to talk about between 1877 and 2020 than there was in that previous time. That's not true, but sometimes it seems that way because there's a lot that happens. So when we talk about the Gilded Age, we are starting in a period of US history where the US is rising to power. The US is getting more and more wealthy, and the US is involving itself with the affairs of other countries to a much greater extent than it did before. And you might ask yourself, wait a second, why is this age gilded? What does it mean to be gilded? Well, remember gilding, I have here, this term really comes from the famous American writer Mark Twain, humorist, political commentator, etc., anti-imperialist Mark Twain. Mark Twain was very much against the United States getting involved in the events in the affairs of other countries. Mark Twain was the most popular writer of his day in the basically 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. This book of his, The Gilded Age, was what gives the name to this particular period. And notice one ironic thing about the Gilded Age is this is what gilding is. If you look at the cover of the Gilded Age, there's this gold color on it. If you find an old book from the 19th century, a lot of times, and this is actually true of books today, they'll have stamped on the spine or stamped on the front cover some sort of image which has in it some sort of gold paint. Remember, gilding is not gold. Gilding is not actual gold, right? It's gilding. It means it's painted gold. So that's kind of important when we talk about the Gilded Age. We're not talking about a golden age. We're talking about a Gilded Age. And so when Twain used this term, he was kind of making a joke. He was making a joke that the United States was not going through some sort of golden age like you might have been talked about in Greece and Rome, that he was commenting that many people saw it as that because the United States was getting more wealthy. But Twain had a much more critical look at this. He said, this is not a golden age at all. This is an age in which is actually kind of materialistic, where people are much more concerned about money. People are much more obsessed with money, much more obsessed with amassing money to the extent of that's the only thing that they're trying to do. It's a crass age. It's an age in which, and this was Twain's kind of critique of it, it was an age in which people seemed to be becoming more wealthy, but people seemed to be becoming less concerned with the affairs of their neighbors. It became more of a dog-eat-dog age, or as we will see later, a social Darwinian age, in a sense. Also, we can often think of the Gilded Age as an age which is really gold paint on steel, because the metal of the Gilded Age is not gold, although remember we had the gold rush in 1849 and the United States went through a series of gold rushes. There was another gold rush in the 1890s called the Klondike Gold Rush, which took place in Alaska. But this is not an age of the metal is not gold, the metal is steel. The main metal of this age is going to be steel, which is what is going to be used in railroad ties, and it's also going to be used in skyscrapers. One little factoid which you can take away from this course is that if you look at a skyscraper and if you ever wonder how they're built, just look at a railroad tie or just look at a railroad and look at that steel girder that's on the ground that the train would travel across. The first skyscrapers were actually made out of the $1880 is because they're not using this method of construction because they don't have the ability to create steel like they do in the 1880s. That's why you have skyscrapers. Before 1880, there's no such thing as a building really that can be much more than 6 stories tall, mainly because most of them are made of stone and they would collapse. So you have to have some sort of infrastructure inside the building that's that's really lightweight, that you can just sort of hang lightweight stuff on these railroad ties, which are straight up. So this is going to be an age which is not going to be an age of gold. It's really an age of steel, but it's painted gold. So clever, huh? And it's also an age of mining. Much of the American West, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is huge mountains are going to be dug up. And it's not going to just be about searching for gold. It's going to be about searching for copper. It's going to be about searching for iron. It's going to be about searching for things like borax. It's going to be an age where the United States rushes to this sort of newly claimed West and starts to dig, much of it on Native American land, and starts to dig for ores to try to create these massive metal cities, which are going to spring up all over the country. And so when you look at a metal city today, such as the metal city that you live in, we all live in metal cities, know that this is really the product, these massive cities all over the world are a product of mining, which really began in earnest in this way in sort of the 1880s, in sort of this rush to the American West, at least in the United States. And then of course, these sort of design techniques take place all over the world. It's also an age where it's often not gold, which becomes the major metal that people are referring to, but silver. Silver becomes mined to a large extent out west. And in fact, there's a whole movement to try to make silver the main American currency as opposed to gold. Most currencies used to be were backed by a specific metal, and was a movement called free silver, which was an attempt to get silver to back American currency. And this was very popular out west. And you'll read about it when you read your textbook. We won't cover it too much in this class because there's just only so much we can cover in these lectures. Well, let's look at how the United States as a factory system changes from the first half of the 19th century to the second half. Because we talked about the way that the American market grew up in the first half of the 19th century. And if you remember, one of the sort of symbols of that were these mill girls. These mill girls who worked in these mills in Massachusetts in the early 19th century were some of the first factory workers. And most of those early factories, which really start to spring up, at least in the American Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, really start to spring up in places like Massachusetts and New Hampshire and the Northeast. And these factories, by the way, are what makes the United States at least makes the Union so strong in relation to the South during the Civil War, because the South doesn't have a lot of these factories. The North is producing mainly consumer goods. So these early factories are creating things like shoes. One thought process is, if you lived before 1810, you probably owned one pair of shoes. You got those shoes constantly reworked by somebody named a cobbler, who would go in and refashion that pair of shoes and maybe use the same shoe. So as your foot grew, even when you were a child, you didn't throw out those shoes. You kind of reworked that leather into a different shoe, etc. So repaired that shoe over time. So you might have one pair of shoes. Well, once these factories come about, people are able to afford a lot of shoes, because the shoes that are coming out are much cheaper. Because you have these factories are churning out hundreds of shoes a day, and now people are owning more pairs of shoes. That's just an example, right? So now you have kind of the beginning of a disposable culture, which is beginning, right? You have people who are able to own a lot of one thing. That goes for shoes, furniture, paper goods. All of these things start appearing in abundance. Books start appearing in abundance, largely because of their factory construction, starting really in, say, the 1830s. And all of these goods, cloth, for instance, these are all consumer goods. These are goods that people like you and me would go to a shop and would purchase. And this was the first kind of US industrial revolution. Now, there are other things that are being constructed during this time. There are obviously, the railroads are really just starting during this time too. There are many other things that are being constructed by factories, but it's really the first boom in the United States, at least in the northern United States, is going to be with consumer goods. Now, in the 1880s, which is obviously the course that we're discussing now, there's another boom in factories, but these factories are not, yes, they're still making consumer goods. Don't get me wrong. Consumer goods are still a big part of why the US economy is getting so strong at this point. But the thing that really accounts for this US boom is capital goods. You have locomotives. Now, you and I are not going to go buy a locomotive. You and I are not going to buy railroad ties or building materials. These are things which are purchased by corporations. These things are purchased by collections of people who are putting together large-scale projects. But the US boom at the end of the 19th century is much more dependent on these sort of machine goods, which are not things that you'd own in your home or want to purchase in a shop. They're much more things that are being used to construct, in a sense, and if you want to think about this in a kind of diabolical, bizarre sense, these are now the boom is in goods that are made to create other factories. So your first factory boom is to create things that you and I use. Your second factory boom is to create things that other factories will use. And so you're actually creating factories which create other factories. So you're kind of having this distanced from the individual. The economy is just growing in leaps and bounds in that way, in which the things that factories are producing are the things that will create in other factories. And there's something kind of very, very strange about that, which sometimes is sometimes disturbing if you think about it enough. But you're getting more distanced from what the factory is making. It's almost the factory is kind of a machine or a force unto itself. And whereas consumer goods in the first half of the 19th century were really concentrated in, say, the American Northeast, the capital goods boom is really concentrated in Pittsburgh, which is a little bit to the west. I mean, if you look at a map, and these Pittsburgh mills. I think I have some pictures coming up of them. Well, I have some pictures coming up of them, but the mills are construction in Pittsburgh because this is the best place to get those raw materials from the west and have access to Eastern buyers of this. So, and let's talk about steel, because Pittsburgh is really going to be about steel making. If anybody follows football, you know that the professional football team in Pittsburgh is called the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the reason why is because the steel boom is really what makes Pittsburgh the city that it is today. It's all of the steel mills there. In 1856, you had invented something called the Bessemer converter. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. This Bessemer converter now you were able to construct steel on a limited basis prior to the Bessemer converter, but it's really only in 1856 that these large Bessemer converters can, in an industrial way, convert so much of this pig iron into steel. And primarily this is being used for railroad track, and then it's being used for skyscrapers, and it's being used for all other uses. Anything you see and you see steel, it comes from a sort of early Bessemer converter kind of process. And so in 1856, the Bessemer converter is invented. A man, and this is just one example, there are other individuals in this, although Carnegie's a really important figure. In 1872, Andrew Carnegie, who is a very, comes from very modest means as an Irish, he comes from Ireland. He starts work as a bobbin boy at a factory, and he sort of starts to work his way up, sort of by luck, sort of by, sort of his own moxie, as you might call it. He starts to invest in steel, and he eventually comes to really control in many ways a lot of the steel making in Pittsburgh. This makes him absolutely fantastically wealthy. And one thing about a Pittsburgh steel mill is one of the things that Carnegie would innovate was creating a giant factory. He creates the Homestead, which is basically like a giant city inside Pittsburgh, where all of the people who work in the steel mills work and live. And we'll hear about Homestead later. And what they're doing is they're taking iron ore, which is necessary for steel, from the Midwest, which comes through the Great Lakes, and you could bring it down the river into Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh used to be that the Pittsburgh Pirates used to play at a stadium called Three Rivers Stadium, because it's at the confluence of three rivers, and that's where most of these goods are coming down. You get coal from Appalachia to fire those Bessemer converters, and then you have the iron ore, and then you sort of mix it up all in Pittsburgh, and then you send it east, which is how New York as a skyscraper city was built, and all the other skyscraper cities. They're all built from this Pittsburgh steel, which is all the raw materials are really coming from the west in Appalachia, and then the steel is being created and being moved to the east. And the result is an absolute industrial boom in the American Midwest. You have coal and iron mining, shipping, railroads. This is really transforming the entire country and transforming how the resources of the entire country are being amassed and created. Here is a great map that kind of gives you a sense of this. Here is Pittsburgh, right? Here's Pittsburgh here. All of these triangles are US steel plants. These are all coal deposits. So what is happening is these coal deposits are being mined, they're being moved, the coal is being moved to Pittsburgh, and then through these Great Lakes, you're having iron ore, which is also being mined, moved here's the iron ore deposits, here you have gray, and they're all being moved to Pittsburgh, and then they all move to east to create these massive eastern cities. And that's about 1900. Here is some of the effects of some of this mining. This is a coal mine, I believe, or a mine in West Virginia, which is right in the heart of what we call Appalachia. And this is called strip mining, in which they basically just cut off the tops of mountains and basically take as much of the ore, which is below these mountains, to be used. This is a picture of a Bessemer converter. Notice the man underneath, who is that tall, and these converters would hold molten steel. So what they would do is you put all of this together in there, you cook it up, and then it comes out the bottom, and you pour it into these molds, and that creates tracks and steel girders, etc. Notice the railroads. The railroads are, you have railroad growth between 1870 and 1890. So these major rail lines are in green. The major rail lines added between 1870 and 1890 are in red. And so all of these rail lines are bringing all of this ore, much of it to Pittsburgh and to other places where steel is being made, but largely Pittsburgh. And it's the railroad which also makes this growth. The railroad, it runs on these steel ties, and the railroad brings the raw materials to Pittsburgh to create more steel ties. So it gives you an idea of how, and this happens really, really fast. I mean, if you look at a skyscraper city, you're like, wow, how is that built? Remember, over the course of, if you knew somebody who, if you lived during this time, you just saw massive changes in the way that cities appeared between 1870 and 1920, largely because of this process. Then there were inventions. This is also the age of the inventor. I have here one invention, which you probably have never heard of, but gives you a sense of, the plans here give you a sense of how many patents were going through at this time. People were patenting all sorts of inventions that made some people fabulously wealthy. Here's an example, which is the automatic coupler. Used to be in a train yard. Trains would come together, and what would happen is people would, there'd be somebody who would join the trains together, and this person who would join the trains together would put a peg into a hole so that the cars would stay together. And this peg often was a really dangerous thing. People get crushed between these trains. People lose hands between these trains. And this thing called the automatic coupler would come in to kind of, it would automatically lock the trains so that they come together and that person wouldn't have to lose their hand or get crushed. And just this simple invention, this automatic coupler, one of these inventions of this period, revolutionizes the way the trains work. And there's thousands of different inventions like this which are coming out at the time. So this is really the age of the inventor. It's going to be the age of Thomas Edison. It's going to be the age of all of these different electric inventions which are going to come out as well. And we'll talk about them as we go on. Well, we talk about this period also in the context of something called big business. And you might ask yourself, why is it called big business? Well, well, it's big. Okay, but it's big in a lot of different ways. And so I think it's important to go through the different ways why it's big, because it tells us why the term comes about. It's not just that it's big business. It's, if you think of business before the Civil War as relatively small scale businesses, right? A few people working in a factory, usually not a lot. Why is this business so big? Well, there's 4 reasons, and there's 4 reasons which you really should know about why the business is so big and why it's big in relation to the United States in particular. And why it's not big, you don't say France's big business because, well, one is geography. The United States is a huge country, right? The United States is a huge country that stretches across the entire, this in thousands of miles. This is much, much bigger of a country geographically than many of those other countries that also have industry at this time and are also industrializing. So the United States is unique in that it's this massive country which is industrializing all at once. Other huge countries, such as Russia, are really not going to industrialize until 1930s and 1940s. The US is industrializing really in the 1880s, 1870s. So it's got a huge geography. It's got a population which is spread out in this geography. So the population is growing, but it's also a population which exists all the way from, say, Los Angeles, all the way to New York, all the way to Chicago, all the way to Florida, et cetera. So this is a population which is, one thing about the population is it's relatively homogeneous. And I say relatively because remember, it's homogeneous in the sense that there are people who speak generally the same language in Los Angeles, New York, Florida, Chicago, right? Now, there are different communities. There's the African American community. There's obviously the Latin American community. There are other small, there are smaller sort of micro-ethnic communities. There's Native Americans. I mean, but generally, the population that is being served by this business is largely buying a lot of the same things. There's a mass market for it. So one example I always love to give is everybody eats cereal, right? Everybody's had cornflakes or Cheerios or something along those lines. Look, cereal is a great example of a mass market because in 1890, there's a place in Battle Creek, Michigan called the Kellogg's plant, which is making cereal, which they're shipping in these train cars and shipping them all over the country. So if you lived in Los Angeles or you lived in San Francisco or you lived in New York, you're eating the same Kellogg's cereal. Whereas before you just like eat, whatever it was for breakfast. Now you're eating this box cereal and Kellogg's becomes a huge corporation as a result of this. So you have a widespread population which are kind of buying the same things over a huge geography. So it's a massive spread geography. It's a big population. These markets become very big for these particular corporations. That's why American corporations are some of the biggest corporations on earth, because they're already dealing with a huge geographic span with a huge population. And then they go international, right? So US corporations tend to be very large because they already have to serve a very, very large population and geography. Also, it's big because of social mobility. I always use the example of blue jeans. Obviously, we're not in class, but I usually do this in a class, and I say, how many of you wearing blue jeans? Are you wearing, whatever you want to call it, dungarees or whatever you want to call it? And usually it's like half the class. Well, Levi's and other jeans makers of the 19th century became very big because they were selling. Now, blue jeans weren't that popular in the 19th century. This is more of like a 1950s thing. But the idea is that you have a mass market for blue jeans, and blue jeans are an interesting kind of thing. Everybody wears them. You could be a billionaire, or you could not have two pennies to scratch together, and you wear blue jeans. It's because the idea in the United States is sort of, there's this leveling idea where people kind of wear the same things and, and follow the same, and you don't want to sort of make yourself seem too wealthy, or you don't want to make yourself seem too poor. And so everybody owns kind of the same things. And so you have a lot of these products like Kellogg's cornflakes. You could be a billionaire and eat Kellogg's cornflakes. You could be a very, very poor and eat Kellogg's cornflakes. So, but in eating them, you have this, you are, or wearing those jeans, you're sort of exemplifying an idea of social mobility, that everybody's either the same, so you can't tell who is more wealthy or not than the other, but also there's a lot of products such as soap and such as other things which are marketed to make it seem as if, well, if you buy this product, you can seem wealthier. And so this idea of social mobility, which remember, you don't really have in France, which has a kind of very stratified kind of network in which it's really hard to sort of move up the social ladder in the sense of, wealth. That is something that is in the United States gets reflected in the products that are sold. So social mobility is one reason why it becomes big also. So all these reasons are why we call it big business. You also have something called a corporation, which you're all familiar with because either, you have some experience with stocks, or you have some experience with corporations, or you're probably wearing, you're obviously wearing things that were constructed by a corporation. You're on a computer that was constructed by a corporation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, where do corporations come from? There's a long history to this, but most importantly is that corporations are a product of limited liability. That if you own stock in a corporation and that corporation does something wrong, you have no liability for what that corporation did wrong. All you're sacrificing in that is the amount of the price of the stock that you bought. So say a corporation does something wrong and their stock plummets to nothing, well, you lose the money that you put into that, but you're not liable for what that company did. So a corporation is a way to minimize the risk of the creation of a company that is this large and this kind of vulnerable to not only lawsuits, but also just vulnerable to collapse. And it's a way for that corporation to raise money. And these corporations start to become, because of all of these big business reasons at the top, these corporations start to become massive corporations. One thing about these corporations is that they also are immortal. Apple is not a person. Your iPhone is not constructed by a person. It's constructed by a corporation. It's constructed by people, don't get me wrong, but they work for a corporation, and the corporation is immortal. The corporation is potentially immortal. I mean, it might lose its name, but the corporation never really dies as a normal person. Why that's important is because in the 14th Amendment, which we talked about, it says all persons have equal protection of the laws. Well, it says persons because it also applies to corporations, which are immortal persons. This is often this is sometimes argued about by economists, but one of the things that protects corporations from sort of dissolution or protects them from a lot of laws is the fact that they go to the 14th Amendment and they say, well, we are persons and we must have due process of law, but they are immortal persons. So a corporation there are corporations that have been around for 200 years. Those corporations are immortal, but they're kind of treated under the 14th Amendment in some ways as persons. This is something which you can research more about. I can't go too much into. This is a fascinating aspect of the history of corporations, but it's something which gives you a sense of why corporations are so big and why the US starts to grow so wealthy so fast because of the innovation of how corporations operate and because of the big business, because of geography, population, mass market, social mobility. Let me give you an example of something. This is a term that you're going to have to know, so pay attention to it. It's called the vertically integrated firm. There is I love talking about this in terms of the Chicago meatpacking industry because it's kind of gross and you probably not really thought about it this much. But if you eat meat and you go to the supermarket and you buy meat, sometimes you might wonder where it came from. Sometimes you might not, right? I think a lot of times if you say you eat a steak, you're like, oh, it's a cow, whatever. Where does that cow come from? Well, it used to be back in, 1820, you knew that cow, right? That was your cow. You cut that cow up and you ate it. So you knew that cow. Increasingly, what starts to happen is you start to have butchers, right? You have a butcher who you would start to go to a butcher and you buy from that butcher, especially in cities, because obviously you're not going to have your own cow in a city. You go to the butcher is going to give you those cuts of meat. And the butcher is going to do the butchering of that cow. And usually the butcher is that's going to be the person that's going to know that cow. Well, then what starts to happen is with the advent of the railroad, you start to have railroad cars which are refrigerated. A man named Gustavus Swift would be one of the people who would kind of innovate this, in which he would start to create these. He created these refrigerated railroad cars. Here you have this ice tank and you have these cuts of meat here. And in Chicago, he starts in Chicago. He basically takes all the cows that come from the West, cowboys put them on the railroad, take the cows move all the way up to Chicago. They put them in these stockyards. You can visit the Chicago stockyards today. They don't operate like they used to do, but anyway. And that's where the cow would be cut up. That's where the cow would be butchered in a kind of industrial way. And then the parts of the cow would be put on these refrigerated rail cars and sent to Swift butchers all over the country, like New York, etc. And you would buy a frozen piece or a chilled piece of meat that came from Chicago instead of you knowing that cow from the early part of the 19th century. And then you know the butcher that butchers the cow. Now you don't even know that. Now you just have a store which sells meat that has come from all over the country. And that's known as, and what happens is Swift not only sort of pioneers the use of these refrigerated cars, he owns the stockyard, he owns the factory where the cows are cut up, he owns the cows, he pays the cowboys in some ways, he owns the butchers that are in each of those cities. So before you had a separate butcher and you had a cowboy and then you had a railroad, now a person like Swift owns all of these different things. And we call this a vertically integrated firm. It is a firm which owns the cow from the birth of the cow to the sale of the cow to you and owns all the little bits in between. Before, these were all different companies or all different people. Another example of this, in even a bigger sense, is oil. It used to be you might sell some oil you found on your land. Well, this really wasn't done. I mean, oil kind of develops as a vertically integrated system in the beginning. But John D. Rockefeller, he strikes oil. So he owns the oil well. He owns the oil refinery where it's being made into gasoline. Remember, he's coming about when cars and other sort of combustion engines are being created, which run on gasoline. He refines that oil into all different types of oil, all that different types of oil he sells all over the place. He owns the gas station. He owns the trucks that move the gas from the refinery to the gas station. So you get an idea. These are called vertically integrated firms. They're a really, really important concept in understanding American business. You can't understand American business, and you can't understand American corporations, and you can't understand why they're so big unless you understand the vertically integrated firm. Here's an example of the rise in dressed beef as opposed to live cattle from 1882 to 1886. So live cattle, there's 280,000 going in stockyards in 1886, and only 70,000. So it drops. So you see refrigerator cars start to increase, stock and the number of live cattle that get shipped start to decrease because dressed beef, which is beef that has already been created somewhere, starts to increase. Here's a picture of some Pittsburgh smokestacks. A lot of this, the environmental effects of Pittsburgh and sort of centralization of all the steel making in Pittsburgh, terrible environmental conditions in Pittsburgh. People's life expectancy in Pittsburgh was very, very low. Children would sort of live in this constant smog, and this is where somebody lives. So there's say this is Homestead. People are working right near this plant, and that is, here's a Pittsburgh in 1906. And this is where people live. So people are really living inside this industrial beast, which is being created in the late 19th century in the United States. What makes this possible? What makes a lot of this possible? Or some of the things that start to come about when we think about the worker, because now I'm going to transition from the creation of these corporations to how this affects workers. Because this is a really important aspect of when we talked about workers, and we talk about that worker, say that Lowell mill girl, that young girl, you say 12 years old, who's working in the mills in the 1820s, 1830s in Massachusetts making shoes, let's say, or whatever. That's a worker who is already moving out of their existence of what they would have done before, right? So early workers from, say, the 18th century are basically largely self-sufficient. They might make their own handicrafts, etc. Now they work in a mill, and now they make handicrafts and that are bought and sold in shops, etc. Well, what starts to happen is that these factories really start to ramp up, and the worker becomes really, in many ways, smaller and smaller and smaller in relation to the massive and large and growing size of, quote unquote, the factory and the factory system in general. So a worker now, that mill girl who worked in that early 19th century American factory, is small in relation to the kind of relationship that they had to their work before. But this miniaturization of the worker in the sense of how small they are in relation to the system in which they're working in increases. That degree of separation between these sizes increases. And increasingly, people in the 19th century, workers in the 19th century, start to feel themselves as, it becomes incredibly alienating for them. Before, one example of this is time zones. And so if you've ever had a job, or you work for, most people work via wages. We talked about this in terms of sharecropping. But if you work for a wage, you work by the hour for the most part, right? So you work by the hour, so you work by a work day. Now, back in the late 19th century, people are working 12, 14-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, okay? So these are terrible working conditions, and you work by the clock. Now, before you didn't work by the clock, you worked by the sun, right? But now clocks start to appear in all of these factories. You have a factory that has a clock, there's a work whistle, you come into the factory at a certain time. And this is an innovation of the 19th century, and it really starts to become the main way that people in the North are experiencing work by the end of the 19th century. So the South, by the way, is a different world. South is still largely agrarian. We talked about that in terms of sharecropping, in terms of the agrarian nature of the South, and how it kind of stagnates industrial during this time. Well, let's look, for example, here is an outline map. This is a map of standard railway time. The reason why we have time zones today is a product of this period. Because if you were on a railroad and you were leaving from Chicago and you were going, say you were going to San Francisco, well, the time that this train left would be hard to reconcile with the time that it was when you got in San Francisco, because the Because how many days would you have gone through? Well, you'd come in and the sun would be in a different place in the sky. Obviously, if you take a plane, you see this in a much more acute fashion because you're kind of outracing the sun in many cases. But these time zones which are created to standardize railroad time. So the only reason why we have these time zones is specifically so that when these goods move across the country and when people move across the country, you can figure out what time they left and what time they arrived, because it gets really confusing. Another example is daylight savings time. Sort of the setting back of the clocks is the way of standardizing time. So time, so workers not only find themselves part of this factory machine, they find their actual sense of time sort of manipulated during this period. This is important. These are important developments in the way that people start to think. And remember, people are starting to become very uncomfortable with a lot of this, especially in the late 19th century. This is, to many people, it feels very unnatural and alienating. You start to have things like standardized parts. For instance, in a factory, your whole job might be to make one particular widget or make one particular part of a train. That's all you do. That's your whole job, right? Your whole job is making that one particular wheel of a particular train or one particular part of a wheel of a train. And so you divide labor up to make all this. And increasingly, that person who's making that wheel doesn't really feel an investment in making that train, right? They don't look at that train and go, I made that. They go, I made that wheel. And they feel they feel alienated from this kind of world that is being created. You used to have people who were machinists that made the machines. Now and today you have robots that make machines If that sounds diabolical, well, I don't blame you for thinking so. But that's really what starts to happen during this time of mass production at the end of the 19th century. You have this increasing alienation of the people who are making things from the things that they are making. Karl Marx actually had a ton to say about this. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but Karl Marx said, well, this was one of the major problems of the human condition in the 19th century. And whatever you think about Karl Marx or Marxism, this assessment is largely true, that people are feeling alienated from their labor, and this is causing labor unrest. This is causing people to be not happy with their position and being not happy with what they're bringing home and being not happy with their jobs and with their work. You have a man named Frederick W. Taylor, who we talked about to a certain extent. Frederick W. Taylor comes up with an idea of scientific management. In scientific management, he wants to sort of formalize in a sort of almost what he calls a scientific way. He takes these pictures, he takes these time and motion studies of people working to kind of find the best worker to wield a hammer. And so basically when somebody comes into the factory, his whole idea of scientific management is you size up that person, you put them to make a particular part because that's a particular part that you think they're best suited to make. And this feeds into something called social Darwinism, which we're going to talk about in a second. This idea that humans are increasingly being seen by sort of factory owners and capital in general as poor or weak or strong, depending upon their use for the factory system. And so scientific management and management in general as a profession rises up. You have a managerial class which sort of sits between the owners of the factory and the workers down below and looks at, and they're the ones that manage the factory through these quote unquote scientific principles. Well, there's a lot of problems with this. The idea is efficiency, but what really gets worked into this is something which we're going to talk about, which is called social Darwinism. One of the things that's going on during the Golden Age is this concept that many of the things that were believed before can now be explained through Darwinian evolutionary theory. If you remember in history, in the first part of the history survey, we talked about how the ideas of racism in the United States get more virulent as you get to the end of slavery. That slavery itself becomes worse and worse, as does racism. That racism, the classification of people according to race, and the attempted classification of people according to race, becomes more and more ossified or more and more frozen as the way that people think about the world. And as slavery gets worse and worse, and people who are enslaved become more and more looked at by sort of slave owners and others as inferior or as not human, which in many cases that is the theory that starts to evolve. This works its way into quote unquote scientific ideas of the day. Now let's look at Charles Darwin. Everybody knows Charles Darwin. You've all heard of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, you might have comes up with the idea of natural selection. If you see here, these are finches from the Galapagos Islands, which you have here. On one island, they have a short beak. On one island, they have a fat beak. Well, this was one of Darwin's examples where he said, look, populations that are isolated over time will evolve differently. He never says, okay, he never says this thing that Herbert Spencer, this is not Darwin down here, by the way, he never says this term, survival of the fittest. So you might have said, hey, wait, I heard Darwin said survival of the fittest. He never says it. Darwin only says that different populations isolated over a long enough period of time will evolve differently. This Darwinian idea starts to be applied by people like Herbert Spencer, who are social Darwinists, starts to be applied to people. So that what starts to attempt to be explained is the differences between different people as observed today or at the contemporarily at the time starts to be ascribed to evolutionary ideas. So that, and one of the ideas of social Darwinism that comes up at the time, remember, social Darwinism is not a science. Social Darwinism is a pseudoscience. It's not a science with any basis in verifiable fact. But the idea that different animals and different species evolved separately and had, different elephants on different continents or different birds, et cetera, comes to be applied to people, even though there is no evidence that people of different, that people from different places in the world really are, we're not different. We're all the same species from 200,000 years ago. We might look different and have different appearances, but we are the same, we're the same species. So, but this idea really, the Darwin idea becomes married with race ideas of the time. Many of these racial ideas had no basis in science before. They were kind of like folk ideas, or they were sort of religiously based or spiritually based ideas. Well, they come to be fused into something called social Darwinism. And Herbert Spencer is the social Darwinist. Darwin is not a social Darwinist because Darwin says, look, I'm a scientist. I don't have any evidence for this. This is not something I'm saying, but his idea. So when we think of Darwin today and we think of survival of the fittest, that is not only is not something Darwin said, it's also not part of Darwinian evolutionary theory. And this is one of the great, great, great tragedies in science and in people's public perception of science in after this period, is that you can explain through evolution the differences between people, because you can't. So you can't in any substantial way, certainly in any sort of substantial way that gives rise to and applies to sort of racist theories about the superiority or inferiority of others. This idea of social Darwinism among people in the United States and in England, because remember the British Empire by the late 19th century is the most powerful empire on earth, and the United States is rising as this massive empire. Those specifically white populations in England and the United States come to see, many of them, certainly not all of them, but come to see them as sort of the heights of civilization. These are the superior empires on earth. And that it is justified for these, and this is what they're saying, I'm not saying this, it's justified for these sort of empires to rule over everybody else because they are evolutionarily superior. Now this, by the way, is the exact same thing that Germany says during World War II. Because they say the Germans claim this other idea of civilizational evolutionary superiority, which results in Nazi Germany. Well, these ideas are also going around in the United States and England. In many ways, you have the battle in World War II, ideologically at least, between at least England and Germany, sort of arises out of these racist ideas coming from social Darwinism. But that's a concept we'll talk about later. And so civilization becomes the justification for conquest and colonization. Africa, for instance, between 1880 and 1920 is wholly sort of divided up between different European powers, all of whom believe they are evolutionarily superior. And through the use of metal and through the use of technology, which many Europeans believe makes them in some way superior, they basically claim most of the African continent for these different micro empires in Europe. That's something which we'll discuss later when we talk about decolonization in the 1960s, which is a major thing we have to understand in relation to the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. U.S. Civil Rights Movement is in many ways a decolonization movement of the American South, which has its analog in what's going on in Africa in the 1960s. So anyway, so these ideas of social Darwinism don't only apply to race, by the way, they also apply to people who are poor and people who are rich. So at least they come to be applied by those who are having these ideas. The poor, for instance, increasingly become seen in this social Darwinian idea as unfit. So if you are poor in a particular city, the idea is, well, and you are not able to, for instance, make yourself wealthy through your own kind of moxie. Well, that is just, quote unquote, as Herbert Spencer would say, that is survival of the fittest. And these social Darwinian ideas today still form, unfortunately and tragically, a major part of the way that many people think. There are different political parties and different groups all over the world still have these ideas about poverty and these ideas about people who are poor and what they deserve. And a lot of this is rooted in this erroneous and quite tragic view of social Darwinism. And it's a mind construct. It's a mind construct that evolves from many of the racist ideas of the 19th century, which had already been in place, and then are grafted onto something called science. So but that's kind of what we might call, the Germans call this a Zeitgeist, which means the feeling of the era. But that is something which is the way many people think in the 19th century starts to become shaped by social Darwinian ideas. Workers don't like this. If you are a worker in a Pittsburgh steel mill with terrible conditions and your life expectancy is, say, 35, and you're working in terrible environmental conditions, you're not a fan. You're not a fan of social Darwinism. And this is where you have labor unions start to come in. Labor unions as collections of people who bound together, who are workers in a particular industry or workers in general, start to bound together in opposition to not only these vague social Darwinian ideas, but to the ideas that they should just sort of accept whatever wage they get and that should be it. You have these organizations which arise on behalf of workers. We're going to talk about two types, just to introduce this. We're almost at the end, don't worry. We're going to introduce two types of labor unions. The first one is one that's not around anymore. The Knights of Labor is not around anymore, and there's some reasons for that, which are fascinating. But the Knights of Labor is formed in 1869. And the Knights of Labor is an organization which seeks to unite all workers. Now, I say all workers. I don't mean Knights of Labor is racist and sexist also at the time. But their idea is they want to unite basically all workers together and sort of emancipate them. Remember the word emancipation from the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. Now, labor is seeing itself in some ways, they're using terms like slavery. Many people, many workers are starting to see themselves as not in control of their own destiny, and they want freedom, right? So you have these American ideas, which sort of are part of the birth of the labor movement. And so labor seeks to emancipate itself from from the conditions that they're in. And the Knights of Labor invites all US workers regardless of skill. So you could be a very skilled worker, you could be an unskilled worker who only does one particular piece of work, and that might not require a lot of skill. Well, Knights of Labor says it does not matter. You can be part of the Knights of Labor. Well, one thing you might notice about this is this could be a massive revolutionary concept. If all workers belong to the same organization all across the United States today and all agitated for their own rights, wow, that would be, and this does occur in other countries. Well, the Knights of Labor starts to engage in something which is, when you think about it, a really, really big deal called railway strikes. At the time, railroads are the main ways that you get goods to market, raw materials, et cetera. That's how the world runs in the 19th century. And the Knights of Labor starts to engage in railway strikes, which basically shut down entire sectors of the American economy all at once. Labor, basically factory owners and many politicians and the U.S. federal government tries to crack down on this use of railway strikes because it really, in many ways, really hobbles the American economy, really largely affects the American economy. And the Knights of Labor start to become, with these railway strikes, quite powerful because just the threat of a strike, just the threat of one of these massive strikes with all workers standing down and not working can have a grave effect on the economy and really can get workers what they want. Well, the Knights of Labor starts to become less and less popular as labor unrest increases during the late 19th century. And you have instead an alternative type of labor organization, which really starts to rise, which becomes kind of, I guess you might say, the compromise between the Knights of Labor power that can be amassed with all workers and its relations with factory owners. And we call these trade unions. And if you think about unions today often involve workers from a particular sector. So you have, say, the air traffic controllers union, you have an airline pilots union, you have a car makers union, you have a garment workers union, you can name it. An industry has a union, you have a teachers union. And these trade unions are are more focused in that you can't be a part of that union if you, like I'm in a teachers union. I can't be in a teachers union if I'm not a teacher, right? So I have to be employed in a particular way to be part of that union. I have to have a particular job. So trade unions rise up and they're largely skilled workers. They're usually workers that already are employed. They're not so many unskilled workers, and today there's a lot of unskilled workers who are not in any sort of labor union because they don't have a trade union, because these trade unions don't apply to unskilled workers. Well, in many ways, these trade unions become the vehicle by which the labor unions really start to gain power, because the Knights of Labor increasingly is seen as too radical. So many workers who otherwise would have joined Knights of Labor as in a sort of a pan-worker movement start to instead join trade unions because they start to agitate for their own conditions based in their own particular line of work. And we call this a closed shop, meaning an open shop would be anybody can join that labor union. A closed shop is you have to be part of that particular line of work to be part of that union. And you start to have worker unrest. Here's Samuel Gompers. He's going to be the real advocate for trade unions. You have somebody like Eugene Debs, who sort of runs for president on the Socialist Party ticket, and he's more of socialism and American socialism, sort of builds off of the Knights of Labor in agitating for all workers together. So that's one difference that you can kind of notice between different unions or different forms of unions. One is this massive idea of all workers together. Another is workers are sort of not bifurcated, but sort of stratified into their different industries. In 1886, May 4th, 1886, you have something called the Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot many of the Knights of Labor sort of call for a meeting in Haymarket Square, which is in Chicago, on May 4th, 1886. There's a tiny little plaque about this, but it's one of the most important events in global worker labor union history. They gather in Haymarket Square to agitate for something called the 8-hour day. They say, look, people should work an 8-hour day. And this is a major movement of the 1880s, where that working for 12 or 14 hours a day not only is in many ways inhuman and is working people to death, but also what worker advocates at the end of the 19th century advocate for is an 8-hour day, because then you can have 3 shifts. For instance, if you have a factory which runs 24 hours, which many factories are running, instead of having people work 12 hours, you have 2 people, one works one 12-hour shift, the other works the other 12-hour shift. Now you can have 3 people work. One works an 8-hour shift, 8-hour shift, 8-hour shift. You increase employment because more people are working, and you split up the day and you limit workers to an 8-hour day, which is a humanistic idea of how much somebody can work during the day, 9 to 5. So when you think about 9 to 5, that's 8 hours, because then there's 9 to 5, then there's 5 to 2, and there's 2 to, so you get the picture. So what happens during this riot is there's a terrible, there's a group of policemen that is sort of a Chicago policemen that is sort of ringed around this protest. Many of these protesters are German immigrants who have a lot of these labor union ideas that they've brought over from Germany. They've called this kind of workers' meeting in Chicago. There's a large German-American population in Chicago. And somebody throws a bomb that looks like this into the crowd of policemen, and it goes off, kills a policeman, and this becomes this just erupts into a melee. This becomes hugely this goes all over the newspapers in the United States about the death of these policemen. Anarchists are blamed for the throwing of the bomb at this time. And this kind of causes a black eye for the Knights of Labor and the idea of organizing all workers together. But it also is today, when you think about May Day, May 1st, which is called the International Workers' Day around the world, that International Workers' Day derives from this particular riot. So even though the United States does not observe May 1st as Labor Day, it observes later in early September as Labor Day. That's because May Day becomes associated with socialism and communism as the sort of idea behind International Workers' Day. But it comes from an American root, because it's commemorating an American event. This is something which a lot of people don't know. And in fact, we don't talk about the Haymarket riot a lot in the United States because of its connection to the organization of all workers together in a kind of what becomes seen as a socialist or a Marxist or a communist concept, which starts to become increasingly unpopular after World War I. And we'll talk about in the United States, and we'll talk about why and how that happens. Because then you have somebody like Eugene Debs, who runs for president rather popularly. He certainly doesn't win, but he gets a lot of votes. And Eugene Debs becomes sort of the face of American socialism at the turn of the 20th century. Samuel Gompers is the trade union guy. Okay, he forms the American Federation of Labor. Today, you might know of the American Federation of Labor as connected to the AFL-CIO, which is an organization of 2 massive trade unions. And the more massive a trade union can become, the more power they can seek to create. But Gompers would be the advocate for trade unionism. So in 1892, you have another bit of unrest at Homestead. Remember Andrew Carnegie in Pittsburgh? He has this giant homestead factory. He's actually gone in 1892. He's gone to sort of his castle in Scotland, and he's left this man, Henry Clay Frick, to kind of control his factory at this time. And there is a strike. The workers, because they do not want to, they believe that they have terrible conditions. They believe that they need to be paid better. They live inside the factory, essentially. They're very unhappy with this. And what Frick does, he initiates a lockout. So if you've ever heard of strikes and lockouts and things like this, a lockout is when workers who are striking outside the factory are actually locked out of their jobs, and then the factory tries to bring in all new workers. These workers are often called by labor unions scabs, people who come in and cross a picket line. Well, in any case, the Homestead strike initiates a whole series of unrest in which Frick calls out the Pinkertons, which is basically like a private police force. The Pinkertons fire into the crowd at Homestead. And this is another massive kind of event in American labor history, in which you have all of this unrest, people die, and you have at Homestead workers who really just want livable conditions inside a factory which they are forced to live in, are then locked out of their homes and locked out of their jobs. And so the Homestead strike is another one of these massive bits of labor unrest at the end of the 19th century, where many people are saying, well, where is this country going? Is this country going to some form of socialism? Remember, Karl Marx is from 1848. Is the United States going to erupt in revolution? Well, and socialism and Marxism during this period of time do become much more popular during the 1890s. Many workers see people like Debs and the ideas of socialism and Marxism as increasingly an answer to the problems of worker and owner of factory, what we sometimes call capital and labor relations. The ideas of Marx become much more and more popular. But then there's that middle road of Gompers who says, well, we should organize in trade unions, and that's how we will agitate for better working conditions and how we will agitate for higher pay. So you have these things erupting at the end of the 19th century as we move into the 20th century. And this is really the end of the, Debs becomes the head of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, this called Wobblies, which is a sort of organization of all of these workers, much like in the same way the Knights of Labor, but under this kind of socialist banner. And so what we have here in the Gilded Age, you see this movement of workers into many of these different forms of labor organizations. And at the same time, you have this growth of American industry. And these are two major exemplars of the Gilded Age that are going on. These different things that are happening in which the US economy is really taking off industrially. American industry and corporations are becoming more and more massive. American cities are becoming more and more massive. And increasingly workers who feel themselves smaller and smaller and smaller are seeing that the only way that they can kind of hold on to their rights and hold on to their identity and hold on to their ability to provide for their family is to strike and is to cause unrest. And you have a huge amount of labor unrest in the late 19th century and early 20th century in the United States. As we go forward, we'll see how this applies to, here's a picture of the Haymarket riot. We'll see how this applies to what happens in World War I. Because in World War I, the order of the European American industrial world to some sense falls apart during World War I. And we'll discuss that obviously in a later. Here's the Homestead strike. Pinkerton's kind of firing on these strikers who are sort of lined up at this Homestead plant, who are locked out. The Pinkertons come in on this boat. Here's some posters of the Haymarket meeting. This is a meeting in Haymarket Square, see both in German and English. August Spies, this is a picture of somebody, supposedly an anarchist who was arrested for throwing the bomb. Louis Ling was sentenced to death. It's unclear whether they actually did it or whether these were just trumped up charges. But in the end, Ling is actually executed. Others are executed for this event, and they become kind of heroes to the workers' movement, and they become, sort of seen as eroding eroding the United States by others. So these are the two sides that are kind of built up in the Gilded Age. This Gilded Age, which remember is not gold, is gilded, might be like painted gold on steel, but it's an age of a lot of unrest. It's also an age of great wealth, at least for a few. That distance between person with the most money, somebody like Carnegie, and the worker with the least money is growing wider and wider and wider during this period of time. And workers are increasingly getting upset about it. And at the same time, the country is increasingly getting more and more wealthy, powerful, large, and also imperialist. And this is something which we'll talk about next Monday, most of all, is we'll talk about the rise of American imperialism, the rise of the United States as a force in the world. Because remember, it's not just railroad ties and skyscrapers that are made with steel, it's warships. It's warships and it's guns. And it's the ability to go all over the world. And in many cases, as we'll see in the Spanish-American War, inherit those former colonies of European powers that have not industrialized quickly like Spain and take them over, such as in the case of Cuba, such as in the case of Puerto Rico, such as in the case of the Philippines. Because the United States is not only industrializing within, it's industrializing within and then also industrializing globally. And the first place that the United States becomes an imperial world power, an empire, is in the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. And what you'll see is that that process of the United States becoming an empire will continue throughout the 20th century at the same time that the United States is rising to industrial might. So the US economy and the US military power are really united. And anyway, I think that's the end of our lesson today about the Gilded Age. Tomorrow, we will talk about the American West. We will talk about one thing that takes place at the same time as this industrialization of the United States. And at the same time really is Reconstruction. Remember, when we talk about these three processes, the sort of expansion of the United States and the exploitation of the American West, and we talk about Reconstruction, we talk about the Gilded Age, they're all really three processes or three ages or three events that are taking place at the exact same time. So while we teach them separately, we understand them separately, we have to understand they're all occurring at the same time. And they're really our main way of understanding the way in which the United States is changing in the years after Reconstruction up until basically 1900. And then what we'll do on Monday is we'll switch to foreign policy and we'll see how the United States becomes this force in the world. Anyway, are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions they want to about anything presented? I guess I'm pretty much done with